Hello and welcome back to the Knitted Blooms Quilt Along. This video is for weeks 3 and 4 out of our 8-week quilt along. If you are just now joining us, be sure that you go back and watch weeks 1 and 2. That was cutting and sewing, the first part of sewing our small flower units. This week we are going to be making all of our rows for our main flowers. Now, I want to say that I have been having so much fun watching everyone's progress and seeing everyone's updates. I always love doing these quilt alongs so much. So thank you so much for joining me. Okay, so weeks 3 and 4, we have grouped those together because we are going to be doing the same thing for both of those weeks. So there are 8 rows in the main flower units, and we are going to be making all 8 rows this week and next week. So if you want to split it up, you could do 4 rows this week, 4 rows next week, or if you're making the modern version and you want to split your blocks in half and make all of your rows for half of your blocks this week, all of the rest for half next week, that works too. There are a few different ways that you can make this quilt, and this is a little bit different from how I've done it in the past. So normally when I'm making the modern version, I will go through and make one block at a time. So I will make one block from start to finish, and then I'll move on to my next block. Whenever I made the traditional version and the 4-color version, I did it a little different. I went through and made all of my rows, and then once all of my rows were done, I went through and made my blocks. And that's kind of what we're doing for this process. I think it's a really good way just to stay organized and to streamline the repetitiveness of these different steps, just so that we're not task switching so much. We can kind of get in the rhythm of doing the same thing over and over. And I think it'll kind of be fun to get in the groove and work through all of the steps at the same time for all of our blocks. Now, of course, if you want to go through and make a sample block just to test it all out and see how that block is going to look, or if you would like to go through and make one block at a time, you're welcome to do that. We would love to see how your blocks turn out, but just know that for the quilt along, we are spending weeks 3 and 4 making all of our rows, and then weeks 5 and 6 will be our block assembly weeks. But this week we are strip piecing. So this is just like what we did for the small flower units. We're strip piecing all of our rows. So remember that the modern version has its own set of instructions, and that's essentially one block of instructions. And then the traditional and the 4-color version, those are both the same instructions, and you will refer to the size that you are making in that chart. And as the sizes get bigger, you're going to have more and more strip sets to make. And then you'll refer to the far right column of those tables, and that tells you how many rows you need to cut. So you're essentially making 4 of each row. Let me make sure I'm getting that right. 4 of each row per block. So that's kind of the math that you'll see in the far right column. So we'll start with row 1. It is a background strip and a foreground main flower. We will pin those 2 fabrics together and then sew them together with our 1/4-inch seam. There's no need to backstitch this seam, but remember that you probably want to use a relatively small stitch length. So like a 1.8 to a 2.2, anywhere in that range is good for strip piecing. Then we're going to press that seam open. And at this point, it's a good idea to double check your seam allowance. Really, I do this all along this process. So the pattern has lots and lots of benchmarks for you to double check your measurements and make sure that they're measuring what they are supposed to be measuring. So remember, if it's smaller than that measurement, that means your seam allowance is just a little bit too big. And if your piece is measuring larger than what the pattern says, then that means your seam allowance was a little bit too small. Now, you could have the opportunity to just square up your block at the end if your seam allowance is too small. That's definitely an option, but it would be helpful if you could get your seam allowance as close as possible to what the pattern says your piece needs to measure. That's really going to give you the best results, but you can have the opportunity to square up your blocks at the end if you would like. So just keep that in mind. I always have just like a couple of areas where there's like a little bit of fabric, a little like maybe a few thread widths that I need to trim off in a couple of different spots in my blocks, and that's okay. So just keep that in mind as you are making these rows. And regarding your seam allowance, if it isn't what you want it to be, it's easier to seam rip this piece and fix it now, as opposed to once you have already cut apart your strip sets. So your part A piece should measure a certain measurement, and you want this first row to measure exactly the measurement of that part A unit. And if it doesn't, then those pieces aren't going to fit quite right. So if you need to adjust your seam allowance, go ahead and seam rip that and dial it in. Remember, I have a blog post all about seam allowances, and I also have a blog post about scant 1/4 inch seams. So if you need a refresher on that, feel free to go check those out. And then we're going to cut apart our strip set just like we did with the petal units. So we're going to square up one side, flip it over, and then cut our pieces from there. Remember, I'm right-handed, so I hold my rotary cutter with my right hand, and I cover the piece that I am trying to cut out with my ruler, and I use the lines on my ruler. Now, if you are making the 4-color or the traditional version of this quilt, then you have a really great opportunity to use a stripology ruler. So it really speeds things up so much. So remember that you can refer to the stars on the ruler for a quick glance of your cuts. So if you're making the traditional or the 4-color version, especially if you're making one of the larger sizes, the stripology ruler is going to save you so much time. I cannot recommend it enough. This is not sponsored. I just love their ruler. So check that out if you would like. And then once you have all of your row ones made, either for all of your quilt or for that particular block that you are working on, then you can move on to the next block and make all of your row ones for all of your blocks, or you can just work through block by block, make your row 1, row 2, row 3, and so on. So there's a couple of different ways to work through this week, so feel free to choose your own adventure and kind of just do whatever feels good. Couple of key takeaways for this week. Remember to use pins. Pins really help keep your fabrics from shifting, especially with those longer seams. Also use a relatively small stitch length. So like I said, 1.8 to 2.2. We don't want our seams to unravel super easily whenever we go to cut through them for strip piecing. And then finally, you just want to keep an eye on your measurements of your strip sets for all of your rows. So you want those rows to measure exactly what the pattern says. So if you are cutting 1.5 inch by a 6.5 inch piece, then you want the width of your strip set to be 6.5 inches. If it's 6.25 inches, then that means that your seam allowance was a little bit too big. So definitely make adjustments for your strip sets before you cut them apart. Really, whenever we go to put our blocks together, having accurate strip sets that measure exactly what the pattern says is going to help us put together these blocks more easily. So pay close attention to your seam allowance. Okay, so for weeks 3 and 4, we are making all of our rows 1 through 8. If you are making the modern version, go ahead and keep all of your fabrics in a pile, just like we've been doing. We're keeping all of our part A units together with their matching main flower rows. So keep your piles, keep everything nice and organized. If you're making the traditional or the 4-color version, then I just keep all of my row pieces in a pile organized by row. So I have all of my row 1s, all of my row 2s, and so on. Then you are officially finished with weeks 3 and 4. So before you go, I want to tell you about our prize for this week. So this week is a Lo and Behold merch bundle. So we're gonna pick 2 winners for this prize. We're gonna pick one for week 3, one for week 4, and all you have to do is share a photo of your progress for week 3 and 4, tag Lo and Behold Stitchery in the photo and in the caption, use the 3 hashtags, Knitted Blooms QAL, Knitted Blooms Quilt, and Lo and Behold Patterns, and post it before the start of week 5, and then we will pick 2 winners from there. Thanks again for tuning in. I cannot wait to see your progress from weeks 3 and 4. By the end of week 4, you should have all 8 of your main flower unit rows constructed, and then in week 5 and 6 we are going to assemble our blocks. So we're going to sew all of those rows together in weeks 5 and 6. I'm so excited. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.